Zach with Wingar Wearables. You are one of 12 special people who's going to watch this video to the end. And today's video is about the Stingray Tomahawk. And if you are considering adding the Stingray Tomahawk to your everyday carry, then this video is for you. Now, if we go to 2016, when I started designing Tomahawks for comfortable everyday carry, I was primarily focused on carry comfort. And it would eventually lead to our back ripper and Empress Tomahawk designs, designed for inside the waistband carry. But at the time, I was purely focused on carry ergonomics and packing in as much combative capability as possible, like in hand-to-hand combatives. I was not at the time taking the act of tomahawk throwing seriously. I looked at that as like, oh, that's just something some people do for recreation, like Boy Scout Jamboree type thing. I was pretty dismissive of throwing tomahawks in combatives. And that was because I was ignorant of how prevalent it really was. So our back ripper tomahawk is not designed for throwing at all. It's very optimized for hand-to-hand combatives. And our Empress Tomahawk can be thrown primarily at like foam-based targets. It's not going to hold up throwing into wood targets. But as I started researching tomahawks more and reading these historic accounts, I kept coming across more and more examples of tomahawks being thrown in combatives. Think the context of like, smoothbore, muzzleloader, flintlock ignition, unreliable ignition. You had one shot, in an ambush, engagement, and then you had to close in with the enemy armed with your tomahawk and that sort of thing. And so that really challenged a lot of the beliefs I had going in. I thought it didn't make sense to throw your tomahawk in combatives. You were throwing away your weapon. In reality, warriors that were throwing their weapons, they didn't only carry one tomahawk. They often would carry almost always a long knife as a weapon to transition to after the tomahawk was thrown, but also sometimes multiple tomahawks, sometimes a war club, that sort of thing. So, they were really armed to the teeth with multiple weapons. So throwing a tomahawk at someone, you weren't losing your only close quarters weapon. And often in the historic accounts, it seemed that tomahawks were thrown at first opportunity, not in an act of desperation. And so it really made me think about, hey, if this was seriously done back then and a lot more prevalent than I had realized, what would we do with Wingar Wearables to design our own tomahawk that was optimized for throwing? And it's clear that when you read the historic accounts and you also look at historic examples, that although all tomahawks can be theoretically thrown, like you can grab it and you can chuck it at somebody, some tomahawks were clearly more optimized for the throw, for injuring someone in a throw, than others. And so, as we dug deeper into it, it became pretty interesting. So, what we're going to go into in this video is a bit of the features that we've incorporated into the Stingray Tomahawk that make it more optimized. So, think about the context of throwing a tomahawk at a person in combatives. Like they're your opponent, you want to take them down as fast as possible with minimum risk to you. They're going to be armed with something, could be, in the historic cases, a smoothbore muzzleloader or a tomahawk, that sort of thing. But when you're throwing a tomahawk, it's revolving, it's spinning in flight, and you cannot control the distance that you're engaging your opponent. So as that tomahawk is turning, revolving in flight, when it impacts an opponent who's a vertical target, like imagine it's just coming in at a random impact orientation, you want to maximize your probability that that impact of the tomahawk is going to incapacitate the opponent. So when you look at tomahawks like this is a cold steel, it says American Tomahawk Company on the sticker, but it's made in Taiwan. This is a cold steel trailhawk, right? This is a pretty popular, extremely cheap tomahawk that a lot of people enjoy. But it's got features that, yes, it can be thrown, but are a lot less optimal for that sort of engagement where the tomahawk is spinning in flight and it's impacting at some random orientation. Like you aren't going to be able to control your distance from the opponent to make sure in the cycle of its revolutions that it's going to give you a chopping blade impact. So what I did is we got some, you can't see it in front of me, but I have some grid layout, like it's like an inch by inch XY coordinate grid, and I put tomahawks down flat on the grid and moved them, slowly turning and taking measurements and that sort of thing, until, based on my own experience at throwing tomahawks, I knew I would get a chopping blade impact or a hammer pole impact or a handle impact, that sort of thing. And I ran through the trigonometry of those measurements. And when you have this cold steel trailhawk, which is 22 inches long, that handle is so long it kind of gets in the way of the chopping edge getting buried. The chopping edge is about 2¼ inches and projects about 3½ inches from the handle. But it's also not flared in two directions. It's a fairly straight chopping edge. And so when you run through the trigonometry of its revolutions and spin, it's only going to stick the chopping blade into a vertical target at about 66 degrees out of the full 360-degree revolution of spin. And that works out to about a probability of chopping blade impact of about 18%. So you're throwing this tomahawk, it's spinning end over end, and it's going to impact at a random orientation. Your probability of that resulting in chopping blade impact on somebody is under 20%. That's not very good. Now, that's not to say any other impact orientation is going to be ineffective. You can see, horrible street fight videos that go on now where, a couple instances, or you watch the video and someone will throw their smartphone at somebody. A smartphone weighs 6 to 8 ounces, right? And just throwing it really forceful, hard object, hitting someone in the forehead, knocking them unconscious. Like, clearly, if this tomahawk hit handle first or hammer pole first in your forehead, it would knock you unconscious. But you can't count on those blunt impacts, which aren't terribly focused, hitting someone randomly in the body and having an incapacitating effect. Now, when you compare the cold steel trailhawk to the Stingray, right? The Stingray is only 12½ inches long, and it weighs about 12½, 13 ounces. This is 22 inches long, weighs about 22 ounces, so it throws a lot slower. The cycles of spin rotation occur over a longer distance for each rotation, and as we've said before, about under 20% of its spin will get a blade stick. Well, with our Stingray Tomahawk, the chopping blade projects about 2 inches from the handle, but it's a 2 5/8 inch wide blade. It is significantly wider. And the handle is shorter, so it gets out of the way of the chopping blade faster in its rotation. And we have rounded this section of the handle so that on under rotation impact orientations, this will still result in the chopping blade skipping up and into the target. So when you run through the trigonometry of this, about 110 degrees out of that 360 degrees will result in chopping blade impact. And it's flared out in both directions so that frontal direction and flare will get sticks even at fairly steep impact orientations. So that's just the chopping blade alone, significantly greater probability of getting a chopping blade impact than over a conventional, like, long-handled tomahawk. Now, as it continues to spin, there is a band where there is not going to be chopping blade impact. But as it continues to turn over, so I'm referring to my notes here as a challenge here, we have this long chisel tip spike, and it's sort of like a ramp. And so even at very off-angle impact, it will stick into targets. So you get about a 65 degree of angles where the spike side will stick into target. So again, as it's spinning in flight, you get chopping blade impact, then you have a band where it's going to be sort of blunt impact, and then you have a band of spike side impact that's about 65 degrees. And then as it turns over further, the handle comes over, and there is going to be a band of angles where the handle is going to be primarily blunt impact, but our handle comes to a chisel edge, a whole lot sharper of a focused impact than the Trailhawk. So as that turns over, you wind up having about 70 degrees of rotation of angle where the chisel tip is hitting into the target. And this is a hard hickory handle, and I've thrown it at our wooden tree trunk style targets, and the chisel tip will create, it won't bury the handle into the wood, but it'll create a dent in the wood that's about as wide as the tip of your thumb and about half as deep. So it's a lot more focused of a blunt impact than this. And so, you do see some historic examples of tomahawks that even they would put like conical iron cones on the butt end of the tomahawk. They were trying to get that sort of enhanced focused impact on handle impacts. So when you roll through all the angles on the Stingray, on here I had to write down. Oh boy, there's a little energy draining. So out of that full 360 degrees of rotation, it's kind of like you got 3 slices of pie in a round circular pie, where you get chopping blade impact, then you got spike side impact, then you got handle impact. It's about 70% of the range of angles in that 360 degrees that will result in some sort of focused impact trauma. So that's probably why when you look at historic tomahawks from certain areas where tribes were renowned for throwing tomahawks, like with the Iroquois Confederacy, there were specific styles of tomahawks that had double flare chopping blades, long spikes, sometimes with chisel tips on them, short handles, and sometimes the handles had, a conical metal cap on the end, that sort of thing. So I think that's probably why you had some of those tomahawk designs out there. They were optimized for injuring an opponent at a random distance engagement when you threw it. And really what it comes down to is, although all tomahawks can be thrown, some tomahawks are going to be better at throwing than others. So clearly our Stingray Tomahawk was optimized for the throw. And I'm not, meaning to be unfair with the Trailhawk. Our backripper Tomahawk is not really good for throwing. It's got a longer handle. It's got a squared off butt end of the handle, so it's not going to skip up into the chopping blade. And the chopping blade is downward canted for carry ergonomics and also aids in blade extraction. But that really limits the angles of rotation where you're going to get a chopping blade impact. This Tomahawk is very, very fast and has good reach for close quarters combatives. But what beats reach? Range. So being able to throw your weapon and project force far beyond where you can reach is a pretty significant advantage. And that's probably why you see, depictions of Iroquois warriors and they're carrying multiple tomahawks. You throw one at first opportunity and you close in with another. So how are the Stingray Tomahawks made? This head is cast from 5160 steel. It's a wax investment casting that enables very precise features. And one of the advantages of wax investment casting over forging is we can incorporate a ribbed eye. And so if you look at 1950s, there was a patent to apply ridges or ribs projecting along the inside of the eye to bite into wooden handles when the axe head wedge was driven down. And that was a more secure head handle connection. So that patent was awarded in the 1950s. It was used exclusively by one company for a while, and then in the 80s when the patent sort of expired, several companies started offering ribbed axe eyes, and these are for like tree felling axes and that sort of thing. To the best of my knowledge, we are the only company to apply that approach for head handle connection to a tomahawk, right? So that ribbed head handle connection on the eye greatly locks down the axe head on the handle. So when you're throwing it and it sticks into a wooden target, it's a very firm head handle connection. So these are Lost Wax investment cast 5160 steel, heat treated to between 57 and 59 Rockwell C. Also, the eye geometry itself, it's got significantly greater volume of wood inside the eye versus are back ripper tomahawks, and that's again to hold up against the stress and impacts when you're throwing the tomahawk into a wood target. Now, it does take a lot of force to seat the axe head on the wood. Like I have to put it in a fixture and use a rawhide hammer and percussive impact transfer pieces to seat the axe head onto the handle. It does not just drop on. You are engraving the wood with the ribbed eyes. And then we drive the wedge. Now, the edges of the head are freehand ground. The head is resurfaced. When it's cast, there is more of a pitted type texture that occurs when you do wax investment casting. So, those pores are removed on a very, very large belt sander. We work with a very talented metal finisher in Pennsylvania. But yeah, so it gets resurfaced. The edges are freehand ground on the chisel tip and the chopping edge. And the handles are hickory along with the wedges from Pennsylvania. The handles are CNC denier net shape. I then saw and rasp the edges and the surfaces, and I hand scrape them so there's texture for your fingers and hands to grip. It's not made on a duplicator machine with a sanded finish and like a wax coating that's slippery. We really want a lot of texture when you're gripping this for either clean release in the throw or in bushcraft or in combatives. You want a lot of grip retention. Also, the handle, we had talked about how the handle was curved in this region for under rotation impacts. Well, it flares out over here so you have better grip retention. So you get that handle swell towards the back end of the handle instead of at the front. And that really works well for positive grip. Now, also, when you're throwing a tomahawk, this is not something that we incorporated early on, but we learned, and I throw my Stingray Tomahawk a lot, probably more than anybody else, right? Because I've been, throwing the Stingrays through development and just practicing, that sort of thing. But when I'm throwing the Stingray Tomahawk, one of the things I observed is, when the tomahawk spike or chopping blade impacts into a wood target, there's a lot of shock and vibration that runs through the wood handle because the tomahawk wants to spin, right? The handle has its own momentum that wants it to continue to spin. And when the chopping blade, or especially the spike side, sinks into the wood, the steel tomahawk head decelerates almost instantly, and the handle still wants to keep going, and it decelerates very quickly as well, and you get these shocks and vibrations that run through the handle. And what can happen is that can result in, because wood is a naturally variable material, some pieces of wood will get accumulated damage and separation of the wood grain. And it just occurs over dozens to even hundreds of impacts and those vibrations, where you can start to have checking form, and it can even lead to a piece of the handle just flying off once it impacts into the target. So to mitigate this, what we've done to increase the longevity of your handle is, you got the handle here. This is a hickory handle where we have attached 3 brass screws along its length. They're along the length of the handle on opposing sides, and even one of them is within the Stingray's eye geometry, this top one here. And so these brass screws go about 2/3 of the way through the handle in these 3 different locations. I then trim off the excess protrusions of the screws. So you have these little brass, they aren't even exposed, they're flush with the wood. But you can see them in the handle on the front and the back. Little brass that's flush with the handle there. And what this does is mechanically connecting the grain as it runs through the handle. So when you get these shocks and impact vibrations that want to lead to layer separation, the threaded brass screws basically keep it all pinned together. And so that's for maximizing the longevity of your Stingray Tomahawk's handle when you're throwing it. Now, for other things you can do to maximize the longevity, of course, throwing at like a foam style target is going to be maximum longevity because you have less shock, like the foam when the blade or the spike hits it. It's absorbing some of that impact energy, so there's way less shock and vibration. If you are throwing at a wood target, pick a soft wood. Like, the video we're going to show of me I'm throwing at a piece of Pollyanna, or it's otherwise known as Empress tree. It's a soft wood that was historically used to make duck decoy targets, very buoyant soft wood. So you definitely want to do that. You don't want to be throwing at a live tree because, well, that's unfriendly to the tree, and often live trees can be a lot tougher. You want to be throwing at dead wood, soft dead wood. That's going to be the best. And you also want to just look around you where you're throwing. Like, are there rocks on the ground? Did you prop up your wood target against a brick wall? You're going to have misses when you throw, or you're going to have, especially as the wood target gets more damaged, you're going to have impacts that don't quite stick and the tomahawk falls. You don't want the blade to fall on a rock, that sort of thing, because no matter how quality your steel tomahawk is, an edge hitting a rock is never a good thing. So always be mindful of your surroundings and try to reduce probability of not only, injuring, people around you or yourself, but also, damage to a tomahawk. Wood is not an invincible material. It is an incredible material. It's incredibly tough, especially, a good piece of hickory. But we have done some things to maximize the longevity of your Stingray Tomahawk handle so it can serve you a lifetime. Now, more about the Stingray. It looks like a stingray fish, right? You got this flared out section here. You have this long section that looks like a stingray tail. And one of the things that we like to do with our tomahawk designs is not only design a new distinctive axe head, but pair it up with a distinctive axe handle, an axe handle look and appearance that's unique. So with the Stingray Tomahawk, we have this head that's shaped like a stingray. And you're familiar with like European swords and Japanese swords that had stingray skin, like leather, in the sword grips. And what we wanted to do was have that sort of visually reinforced. So when the handles are, sawed, rasped, scraped, and they have the brass pins put in them, what I then do is I take basically these custom copper brands we made. I took a drilled a plate of copper hundreds of times with various sizes of drill bits to create a pattern that looked like the pebbly texture of stingray leather. I then segmented up those pieces of copper. I heat them up with a torch till they're red hot, and then I burn each segment in sequence so that you get this sort of texture here, and it results in a charred, raised, pebbly surface. I then take a scraper blade, a draw knife. I use it to scrape off the excess char, and then I stain the entire tomahawk with this sort of red handle look. We then seat the tomahawk head down, engraving it on the handle. I drive the wedge. I then hand drill a conical hole in the top here, and there to create a void. I use the tip of my quill to do that. And my wonderful wife mixes up a black resin. It's carbon black powder with a construction adhesive type resin that's then applied to that conical hole and to any gap in the head handle connection underneath, right? Now the head handle connection is firmly attached because of the rib die and the driven wedge. But what this adhesive does at the top, there's just so much shock and vibration, you can actually have a wedge want to shake out of the handle. I've observed that. And so by creating sort of this conical void and filling it with adhesive, that caps the wedge so the vibration does not result in it walking out. Also, the resin underneath the eye, filling the gaps, prevents entry of water and moisture. And the resin itself, even though it's it cures very hard. It's sort of like a high durometer rubber, kind of like tire tread. And that has a little bit of a shock absorption as well. So, that's how your Stingray Tomahawk is made. The carry system is 60 thousandths thick Kydex, and it's 2 blade covers. You've got the chopping edge side and the spike side connected with a piece of shock cord that keeps these blade covers in compression. And then we've got 2 other pieces of shock cord with these strong alligator clamps. And so you can carry this. I've done an appendix carry inside the waistband. It's about as comfortable as carrying a handgun appendix carry, which is not that comfortable. It does work. I've hiked with it, and you do get used to it, much like appendix carrying a handgun. It's actually a little bit less volume above the waistline than a handgun grip, so in some ways it's a little bit more comfortable. However, my personal preference, I prefer to carry mine under arm, and so you can just take a flat piece of paracord and make shoulder loops. I'll link to a video that goes into more detail on carrying your Stingray Tomahawk below. But it's a very adaptable carry system. It's very minimalist, very lightweight. So that's how your Stingray Tomahawks are made. Now, your chopping blade is very curved because the Tomahawk is fairly wide for how light it is. It's a 2 5/8 inch chopping edge. A lot of historic Tomahawks that had chopping edges, over 2 inches had very curved blades. And I believe that was for concentrated chops against rounded things, whether it's a stick that's rounded when you're chopping for like bushcraft, or you're chopping into a forearm or a forehead. When you have that very curved chopping edge, it's always going to result in concentrated chops, especially against rounded surfaces at different impact orientations. And we've got that double flared chopping blade with rounded trailing edges that results in really good extraction. When it buries into a target, whether it's wood or flesh, you've created a path for the trailing edges, a severed plane that this will smoothly extract from with those rounded trailing edges coming out of it. The spike, it's over 4 inches long. This looks very long, and it is relatively long compared to a lot of Tomahawks that are on the market. But it's got a chisel tip that's about 3/8 wide. And when you look at a lot of historic spike Tomahawks, they usually had blunt tips on their spikes. It was very rare to have needle tip sharp spikes. And we believe that was done to reduce risk of self-injury. So if you're chopping in bushcraft, where you got the chopping blade facing forward in combatives, if this gets pushed against you, not at high percussive force, but a push, that chisel edge is not going to readily pierce. It's kind of like, if you recall, the SKS screwdriver bayonets. It's got a sharper edge than those screwdriver bayonets, but it's still nowhere near like knife-like, piercing edges. So that is a safety feature. It also increases the amount of material up front. So when you're using the spike tip to grub through the ground, you're dragging through that chisel tip as you're raking the ground surface. The spike is also long enough that you can use it as a secondary handle for hand axe type chopping, or even ulu type chopping, or just using this for knife-like utility cuts. And we've chamfered the spike's corners, so it's very smooth for extraction. So if you're burying this into either a flesh and bone target or into the ground, it extracts very easily compared to most other straight spikes on the market. Now, I think we'll cut to a video of me using the chopping and spike side on a turkey. We'll show you real time over here, picture in picture, so you can see how rapid these Tomahawk blades, chopping and spike side, bury and extract target. We also got some kind of gross slow-mos that we're going to cut to, just to show, that sort of, optimized for penetration and extraction. And one last point on the spike, you can wrap your fingers around it and support it in your hand like this for hand drilling type tasks. So that would be more for like focus, like bushcraft, like sticking this into wood and twisting to create sort of a shallow cavity. One of the other features that's unique are the flat sides of the Stingray Tomahawk head. So these act as percussive impact faces. And in some ways, the Stingray, even though it is not a hammer pull tomahawk, it can drive certain styles of wooden stakes into the ground easier than a hammer pull tomahawk. And we'll cut to a video outside where we demonstrate this. So here we have a green sapling that I've harvested to improvise into a stake, a field expedient stake. You cannot be too picky with these, and you can see that this sapling actually has a hollow core. It has very poor mechanical properties, and if you're having to improvise stakes in your environment, you may not get a really high quality, hard seasoned piece of wood to turn into a stake. So we have pretty dense clay like earth and stony ground, and what I'm going to use is the long ramp-like spike of the Stingray to create a pre-tapped hole into the ground. All right, and I'm going to insert the stake tip into the hole to get it started, and then I'm going to use the wide hammer faces on the sides of the eye to percussively drive this into the ground, and the blade side is facing this way for safety. So now I have a forked stake, got prongs here coming off the branches, so I can set another harvested sapling across this to suspend something over a campfire, that sort of thing. It's driven well into the ground. The wide percussive hammer face spreads the impact energy and does not damage as much like the fragile green stake that we have here. And you can drive it deeper, but it's in there firm enough to support something like a fork-like stake should be. And it was done relatively easily. If you had a concentrated hammer pull on a hammer pull tomahawk, that is going to exert more of its percussive impact, damaging this hollow-stemmed, fragile, crappy greenwood, and instead of driving your stake efficiently in the ground. And it's going to have a smaller hammer face so that it's harder to connect with the stake. And with this, you got big wide faces to efficiently transmit your percussive impact energy. Okay, so one of the things to keep in mind is when you're using the Stingray as a hammer to drive stakes into the ground, if you're driving a stake that's very close to something, think a log or a rock or that sort of thing, well, you have the width of the Stingray head that could run risk of running into or raking the edge against something that could damage it, right? So you'd either need to make a longer spike so that it's seated above what it's butting up against, or you would need to take another piece of wood and use it as a percussive transfer block so you can pound that and drive the stake into the ground. Now, I'm not going to claim that the Stingray Tomahawk is superior to a hammer pull tomahawk. I think hammer pull tomahawks, when you're using the hammer pull to percussively bash and damage things, that's really effective, especially in like utility type, breaching type applications. And the Stingray's flat faces on the sides aren't going to be good for like percussively damaging large things, right? And I think a hammer pull really gets its sweet spot when it is driving like metal stakes into the ground, into rocky ground, that sort of thing. So I'm not going to claim that our tomahawk can do everything a hammer pull tomahawk can do, but it can do quite a bit. And so, that's one of the values of having like a real valuable thing with the right type of spike tomahawk. If you design it right, it's got the ability to do an awful lot of hammering percussive impact capabilities, as well as the utility and combative capabilities of the spike. So, this is really just packing in a whole lot of capabilities. Now, some more about throwing your Stingray Tomahawk. I do a lot of my throwing with a unique throwing style where I sort of pre-load the Stingray locked in my shoulder pocket, and I put my body weight into it. It's almost like throwing a punch, and releasing it. I don't walk into the throw and hurl it over my shoulder. You can do that. That's certainly a conventional method of throwing a tomahawk, but I really like that sort of compact stance. You aren't telegraphing the throw that much, and you're just accelerating it from the shoulder pocket and ramping it out. And I have found that throwing style works best with really lightweight tomahawks. Like the Stingray is about 13 ounces, well under a pound. It can accelerate to being thrown well over 30 feet a second, all from in the shoulder pocket. No real exaggerate over the shoulder windups and running into the throw. And we're going to cut to video where you can see some of the range of throws and the spin cycles that occur. So really going back to the Stingray's spin cycle, when it's thrown in flight, you're going from when it's released at chopping edge orientation, in about 4 to 4.5 feet, it's straight on spike impact. And then in about another 4.5 feet, you got another chopping blade impact. So for about every 8.5 feet, it's going through a spin rotation. And so out at 25 feet, with this throwing technique I'm using, for me, I'm getting about 3 full rotations before it impacts. Now, when you're throwing, if you're practicing throws at really close range, like within 12, 15 feet, I do not recommend throwing against flat, hard wood targets. I know that that's the common thing for people to take, sawed tree rounds and throw them. And when I started doing that, when you're first starting throwing these, there's a pretty good chance, right, that you're going to have a handle impact. And the tomahawk is traveling so fast, it's got that hickory handle, it hits a hardwood target, and that hard hickory, it can bounce back at you if you have a flat wooden target. And when it's being thrown at close range, it will bounce back and hit you before you have time to react. That's why I recommend either throwing at a foam target where it'll absorb a lot of the impact, it won't rebound as much, or you throw it at a log style target that's vertical. And what I found is, if you do have an off angle impact that doesn't stick, it's going to skip off in a tangential direction, way more likely than to have it bounce directly back to you. So that's one of the reasons we recommend these sort of vertical log style targets if you are going to throw out wood targets. But foam targets are much safer and have maximum longevity for your axe. All right, so because we've poorly planned this video, we had filmed last week me throwing the Stingray Tomahawk at a turkey. All right, now this turkey had been in our freezer for over 3 years. This was back before COVID, when you went to buy a turkey in the grocery store in our region of the country, they would try to force a free turkey on you. They don't do that anymore. Those deals are long gone. But we basically found ourselves with an extra turkey that stayed in the freezer, and after it was in there for like 3.5 years, we weren't really too into eating it, right? It may have been in the freezer for over 4 years. So for this video, we thawed it out. It was mostly thawed out. It did have a core of ice in it. But I hung it up against our tree trunk style target, and we took some slow-mos of this impacting into target. And one of the things you'll note as the video plays and my wonderful voice speaks, our chopping blade and spike sides are so optimized for extracting out of the target that when we were watching the high speed, the blade or the spike was completely burying into target, but it was popping right out. I think we only had one hit here where like the chopping blade kind of stayed in the target. But you know, against flesh and bone targets, you know, it's not like the Hollywood movies where you throw a tomahawk at someone and it just sticks into them and stays into them. For the Stingray, it's so optimized for penetration and extraction that it's once it impacts a soft target, flesh and bone target, it's going to bury the blade all the way in, and then there's going to be that sort of elastic impact, and it's going to bounce out more likely than not. So that's kind of interesting. It was also gross, and since we went to the trouble of filming it, we're show it again. But yeah, we'll post a video below if you want to see how to carry your Stingray Tomahawk. We had an earlier YouTube post where I go through how I carry it. But I've been carrying the Stingray Tomahawk underarm and with a back ripper in my pants for a couple of years now, and it's been very comfortable. I don't wear two tomahawks on me at all times. Like when I roll out of bed, I wear a bathrobe like everyone else, right? But usually when I go out and about for errands or work type stuff, I'll wear two tomahawks on me because I think these two tomahawks do different things in both combatives and bushcrafting utility. They are optimized for different things. And historically, you look at the diverse designs of spike tomahawks out there. Although all tomahawks can be thrown, some are more optimized for it than others, and some are much better optimized for hand-to-hand combatives and that sort of thing. So each of these have different strengths. That's why I like carrying both of them, because it gives me options. But two tomahawk carry is not a common thing. That's not going to catch on. But if you want to add a Stingray to your everyday carry, we've got a few of them up on the site. And also, do not forget trainers, right? So these are made by Volpe's Training from 3/4 thick HDPE. Especially if you are serious about training for combatives or throwing in context of combatives. If you have a body opponent bag, throwing this at it is going to really damage it. And a body opponent bag, if you're practicing throws just outside of chopping reach, there is a risk that this could bounce back at you. So we definitely recommend picking up these trainers. The trainers are a couple of ounces lighter than the Stingray, but the center of balance is very similar. They feel very similar, very close. A lot closer than a lot of tomahawk trainers you see on the market that weigh not even half that of the live blade. So definitely check those out, pick those up. I'm trying to think of anything else we should cover. I think that's about it. But we've got a few Stingrays on the site. Share this video with a friend. You're one of 12 people who have watched it to the end. Share it so 13 will have watched it. And remember to be edgy.